is there a distinct difference between poor air quality and climate change? And are they both a form of pollution?
Okay, there are both problems associated with pollution. They are different issues, although some of the pollutants are similar for both problems.
What are the impacts of poor air quality on human health?
Well, there's been quite a lot of stuff in the news recently about this, hasn't there? The impacts really are quite significant. So the bill to the national health in terms of admissions for asthma, emphysema, heart attacks associated with air pollution are really quite significant. So we're talking about billions of pounds per year for the national health, and of course perhaps even more importantly, premature deaths and illnesses, quite severe illnesses associated with air quality. So yes, it's a big issue.
So you say it links to asthma. How does that work?
That's a good question, and I think still something of a research issue. Asthma occurs when you have narrowing of the airways in your lungs, and so that restricts the airflow into the lungs and hence the flow of oxygen into the bloodstream. Now, when you breathe in polluted air, one of the effects of some of that pollution is to cause inflammation. It's also why sometimes if you're in a very polluted atmosphere, your eyes run and stream. You get this sort of inflammatory response to some of these pollutions. So if you get inflammation in the lungs, and people who have asthma are often particularly susceptible to that, you get this inflammation, you get this swellings in the lungs, that restricts the pathways, and that's what triggers the asthma. But exactly what it is within the air pollution that causes that, or the sort of biochemical mechanisms that trigger that, I think is still something of an interesting and ongoing research question. But what people clearly see is correlations between hospital admissions for asthma and incidents of poor air quality.
Are there any negative impacts to human health of conventional greenhouse gases?
So we think, I suppose, that the most important greenhouse gases being CO2 and methane. And actually, in terms of their direct contribution to human health, there's no great concern there. In the kind of concentrations that CO2 and methane are present in the atmosphere, then directly they will not do us any harm. However, one of the next gases down on the list in terms of relative importance to global warming is ozone. Now, we hear a lot about ozone, and generally ozone in the atmosphere is thought to be a good thing. It protects us from the UV. But ozone's a little bit of a Jekyll and Hyde molecule. In one part of the atmosphere, in the stratosphere, it's very good. It protects us from UV. But lower down in the atmosphere where we live, actually ozone isn't very good for us. So it's one of the things that will cause your lungs to get inflamed and your eyes to burn and so on. And it's also quite an important greenhouse gas. So ozone's one of the things that really does directly jump across both those problems of poor air quality and climate change.
What are the main culprits that are responsible for poor air quality?
Again, another good question, and there's a lot of potential answers. Ozone is one of the significant ones, and that's one of the simpler things to measure and to understand how it forms. So that's probably one of the main things. Another important compound is nitrogen dioxide. We've been hearing quite a lot about nitrogen dioxide as it's directly emitted from vehicles, but it's also formed in the atmosphere. And as you perhaps know, if you dissolve nitrogen dioxide into water, then you get a solution of nitric acid. Our lungs are lined with water, and so when we breathe in air containing nitrogen dioxide, then we're going to start forming a solution of nitric acid in our lungs, and as you can imagine, that's not particularly good for our health. So ozone, nitric acid, and a compound called PAN, peroxyacetyl nitrate, that's the thing that really makes your eyes water. Probably the main culprits in terms of gases in the atmosphere when you have poor air quality.
Would it be possible for us to have a negative impact on our climate by improving air quality?
It is possible to do things like that. So some things improve one issue, but actually then have a detrimental effect on another issue associated with the atmosphere. But in terms of air quality and climate change, it's thought that most things tend to work in the same way. So if we improve the efficiency by which we carry out our combustion, if we make vehicles more efficient and so on, that generally lowers emissions associated with air quality and also emissions associated with climate change. So most things are a win-win in terms of climate change and air quality.
Are electric cars and hybrid cars really as good for the quality of our air as they are made out to be?
In most cases, yes, if we're thinking just about air quality. There is still a big issue about how the electricity is generated. But in terms of the emissions in city centres, then electric vehicles, however the electricity is produced, are going to have a very strong beneficial effect in air quality in city centres. And that's been encouraged by the government. And for instance, if you've got a hybrid vehicle or an electric vehicle, you don't pay the congestion charge in London and you get zero road tax and so on. So that's a good thing. There is, of course, still an issue if you had a pure electric vehicle as to how you generate the electricity. And so if you happen to live downwind of a very dirty power station, then you might not be so keen on people generating more electricity for vehicles because there'll be a negative effect where the electricity is generated. But in terms of where the cars travel, it's positive.
Was the removal of lead from petrol a good thing for air quality and the environment?
Okay, again, this is a really good example of where improving one issue may have a detrimental effect in another. So lead was introduced, or lead compounds introduced into petrol way back in the 1930s, and it improves the performance of the engine. It makes the engines run more smoothly. However, research fairly soon realized that the large amounts of lead were being released into the atmosphere, being ingested by people, animals and so on, and essentially we were all suffering from lead poisoning. So lead was phased out. But of course the lead was introduced for a reason in the first place, to make the engines run more smoothly. So we get rid of the lead, we still got to do something to the fuel to make sure that the engines run equally well. So what people did was to take the lead out, but to put more aromatic compounds in, things like benzenes and toluenes, into the fuel. So they increased the aromatic component of the fuel. And in general, aromatics are not good for air quality. They're known carcinogens. They also lead to ozone formation. So it's one of these balancing issues. You take the lead out of petrol, that's got big benefits in terms of human health, but we replace that with something else that has negative effects for human health. Very often there's a balancing act, and we've really got to be aware of research into the potential impacts of our replacements to make sure that we don't come across any unexpected problems.
Are there any actual so-called clean fuels that we can use that do not impair the quality of our air?
In terms of fuels that we could legitimately use that will be good for air quality, well, probably the best would be hydrogen. So most of us know that if you burn hydrogen and oxygen, then you get energy and you get water. So that's really the cleanest form of combustion that you can get. And indeed, people have looked at hydrogen fueled vehicles either through fuel cells or through direct combustion, and it works. It's fine. Of course, the big problem is how do you store sufficient amounts of hydrogen? Not everyone's keen on driving around with a cylinder full of potentially highly explosive hydrogen. So hydrogen would be brilliant, but there are practical issues. Things like methane, compressed natural gas are better, but by no means perfect.
Are there any easy and cheap solutions for the problem of air quality?
Well, there are some fairly good solutions. Probably the most obvious one is to actually cut down the number of cars on the road. Unfortunately, I don't think many politicians would get themselves re-elected if they banned everyone from going on the roads. However, we don't need to take quite such draconian measures. And there was a very interesting experiment that was inadvertently done quite a few years ago now. You may or may not remember this, but there was a strike by tanker delivery drivers in the earlier part of the 2000s. And so there were shortages of petrol. And what that did was to encourage people to car share a little bit, encourage them to drive more carefully, more economically, because they were worried, would there be fuel to fill up the next tank? And the perception of everyone was that the streets were empty. But actually what happened was there was only about a 10% drop in the number of cars. But what that does is it prevents these sort of bottlenecks of traffic jams forming, keeps the traffic flowing more freely, engines working more efficiently, so less pollution. So actually there isn't a huge amount of vehicle journeys that we'd need to reduce and to make a very significant change in air quality. So that would be the quick fix without any major detriment, but it takes a little bit of organisation to do that.